and welcome into another edition of the Brian on Baseball podcast. Here we go now on this Thursday, January the 23rd. The year is 2020. I'm Brian Goudsward. Got a busy show for you today during what is Hall of Fame week. Coming up later, we'll talk about the two latest inductions into the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. We also have a free agent signing of note to break down. We'll get to that, involving a National League East club. Also, the top 5 right now, our response to the MLB Network show. The top 10 right now, ranking the best players at every position. Today we'll have our picks for right field and first base, plus this day in baseball history, and a lot more. But we begin with some big news locally because the New York Mets have named their new manager in the aftermath of relieving Carlos Beltran of his duties. Yesterday, the news coming down that the Mets were working towards a multi-year agreement to make Luis Rojas the team's next skipper. Rojas, who was the quality control coach last season, has a lot of experience working in the minor league system with single-A and double-A affiliates of the club, and now he is tasked to lead the big league team beginning in 2020. Now, overall, I'm a little surprised with the reaction of Rojas as the manager. It seems that, for the most part, the reaction has been positive. You've seen a lot of players currently on the roster give their thumbs up for the hire. A lot of fans kind of like the sort of outside-the-box choice that this is for the Mets. And I don't quite look at it the same way, mainly because there were so many other options on the table. There were so many guys with distinguished managerial resumes, whether it's Buck Showalter and Dusty Baker, John Gibbons, John Farrell. The list goes on of guys who've had success managing in the major leagues, taking teams to the playoffs, taking multiple teams to the playoffs in some cases. And yet the Mets' priority here was clearly not experience. It wasn't the first time around when they made Carlos Beltran the choice, bypassing the opportunity to hire Joe Girardi, who was universally wanted amongst this fan base. He wound up going to Philadelphia, and Beltran wound up being the selection. We know what ended up happening there. And the Mets didn't change their course the second time around. They didn't go for experience. They didn't even give the guys I mentioned before a sniff. They kept all of their options in-house. It seemed to come down to Rojas, bench coach Hensley Mullins, the now first base coach Tony DeFrancesco, who managed AAA a season ago, and it was going to come down to one of those three. And I'm just not sure it was the right avenue to explore. I think with a team like New York, you need experience, and especially when the team is a little bit in flux right now, not any of their own doing as far as the players on the field, but because of what happened with Beltran being involved in the sign-stealing scandal, even though it was with another organization, it kind of bled its way into the Mets, and so now there's at least a little bit of problems that you have to deal with, and I just thought the right approach would be to go with someone with experience, like a Dusty Baker, who at one time it seemed was going to get an interview. It turned out that report was false. He is interviewing for the Houston job. But I would just feel comfortable with that kind of stabilizing presence. Dusty, a guy who's taken so many teams to the playoffs, whether it's the Cubs, the Reds, the Nationals, the Giants, all four. You know, when Dusty Baker's your manager, chances are you're going to go to the postseason. Now, he's had his issues in the playoffs and winning a World Series, but that's the kind of guy I thought the Mets needed at this point. It's nothing against Luis Rojas. He might be a very good manager and might be the team's long-term answer down the road. I'm just not so sure that the time is right now. He's still very young. He's 38 years old. Obviously, he doesn't have any managerial experience at the pro level, I should say at the major league level. He did manage in the minors, but I'm just not sure that the time is right considering where this team is at right now. The fact that they are a win-now team, I think a veteran manager would be the better fit at this point in time. The Mets opted not to go that route. Big reason is because Brodie Van Wagenen, he wants to have a guy who he can control, wants the collaboration process to be there. And so a guy like Buck Showalter is not going to stand for that. Now, would I want the power to be in Buck Showalter's hands or Brodie Van Wagenen's hands? For me, that's an easy call. It would be Buck Showalter. But Brodie's in charge. He gets it his way. And Rojas, the positives are there. The fact that he does have experience, the fact that he's well respected among the players on the roster, that he's managed a lot of the players on the roster already. So there are some good things about him, and we'll see how it goes. But overall, I have to view it as a big question mark and just not so sure that it's the right fit at this point in time for a Met team that, as Brodie Van Wagenen says, is trying to win now and is in a very tough division. It's putting a lot on the shoulders of a first-year manager, a very young guy who doesn't really know what to expect with the role, who has to handle the New York media. So there's so much at play here, but again, we'll see how it goes. I'm just not so sure in general that it was the right approach to go. And now moving on, because as mentioned in the open, it was Hall of Fame week, which is obviously a very big week in Major League Baseball, and we know now that we have two new soon-to-be inductions to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. One, obviously, is Derek Jeter, who everyone knows by now, did not receive the vote unanimously, 99.7. I think he'll take that, even though there was one voter out there, out of whatever it was, 397, who for some reason opted not to vote for Jeter. But again, I don't think too many people are losing sleep over that. Should he have been unanimous? Probably. I don't really see any reason why someone out there should decide not to vote for him, but that's the decision that was made, and so Jeter will have to settle with 99.7% of the vote. And then the other is Larry Walker, who, good for Walker in his final year of eligibility on the ballot, 10th and final year, gets the nod to Cooperstown. And I think this was a long time coming. I mean, when you look at the numbers, they are Hall of Fame worthy. And I, for one, am a small hall guy. I think some guys have gotten in recent years who are borderline at best, and I would probably leave out. And I think in general, the Hall of Fame has been too accepting of some players and people out there who want to put every guy who had a pretty good career in the Hall of Fame. No, the Hall of Fame is special and should be reserved for only the best of the best. And with Walker, you get the case, well, he played a lot of games at Coors Field, and that helped him immeasurably, which it did, but the numbers overall were there. He actually had a higher OPS on the road, and the numbers at Coors Field were otherworldly. So it's at what point do you say, oh, this guy's numbers warranted Hall of Fame consideration even though he played at Coors Field? The guy had a lifetime 380 batting average at Coors Field. Now, we know it helps a lot of hitters, but there aren't too many guys who hit 380 at the ballpark. And he did it year in and year out, and he did it home and road, and he did it for the Montreal Expos and the Cardinals. Now, he didn't have a lot of years where he played a tremendous amount of games. I think that was one thing that was working against him. But overall, when you look at the numbers and you see a career OPS of 965, any OPS that approaches 1,000, that's pretty good. And I don't care about the Coors Field factor. He's deserving of the Hall of Fame. I think this was a long time coming. Becomes only the second Canadian to be enshrined in Cooperstown. And again, just good for Walker, who earned this to the fullest degree. As for Jeter, I mean, it was a no-brainer. And again, the unanimous thing doesn't really matter too much to me. I was almost of the opinion he wouldn't be unanimous. I just thought it would be easier for a guy like Mariano, who, what could you quibble with? I mean, he was the greatest closer of all time. Shortstops, there's so many others. Most don't regard Jeter as the greatest shortstop of all time. Some do. But still, the guy, I mean, the career speaks for itself. I don't need to go through the numbers. The fact that he had over 3,000 hits, the championships, all-star year in and year out. And it's such a fascinating career on a lot of levels. And I think one article that I read summed it up well, in that altogether, his career was almost overrated and underrated at the same time. And I thought that was a good way to put it. Overrated because, well, he never won an MVP. He never was the greatest athlete. He was never the flashiest guy in the world. And people want to put him with the all-time greats like Hank Aaron and Willie Mays and the best of the best to make the Hall of Fame. And he was just a very different kind of player. Didn't have the same power, but was a table setter. Played, obviously, for tremendous teams almost his entire career. Did a lot of winning, but oftentimes was the best player on the best team. And just so consistent year in and year out. And it didn't matter, regular season, postseason, any date Jeter played, he was going to be the best version of himself. And I think that's the mark of a great player. easy choice for the Hall of Fame. Obviously, nobody could quibble with it, even though there are some detractors that don't like the defensive metrics, that call him one of the worst defensive shortstops of all time. Whatever the case may be, Jeter's a Hall of Famer. It was close to unanimous. He's an all-time great shortstop, an all-time great Yankee, beloved by the Yankee fan base, and so everyone relishing the opportunity for Jeter to be enshrined in Cooperstown. And now I'm going to move forward to a free agent signing of significance. And there aren't a lot of quality players left on the free agent market at this point. Most of the biggest names are off the board, but you still have some, especially outfielders. We're still Nicholas Castellanos, Yasiel Puig, among others. But one of the aforementioned free agent outfielders has a new home this week, and that would be Marcell Ozuna. There was a lot of thought Ozuna would go back to the Cardinals. That wound up not being the case as he takes his talents to Atlanta, joining the Braves on a one-year deal worth $18 million. Now, I really like this fit. The Braves needed to replace some of the power that's lacking now after Josh Donaldson's departure to Minnesota, and Ozuna presents some of that. He's probably not going to hit as many home runs as Donaldson did a year ago, but he is a dependable source of power, and they needed another bat in the middle of that lineup. It's a very good lineup now with the addition of Ozuna. They have kind of a crowded outfield right now. I think Acuna will go back to playing center field. It looked like he would spend the majority of his time in right this year. They did bring back Nick Markakis. Ender Inciarte is still in the mix as a glove-first outfielder. So you got four quality players, and it'll be a challenge to see how Brian Snitker divvies up the playing time amongst those players. But I like the fit with Ozuna to the Braves, and you look at this Brave lineup, I think it stacks up well with Freeman and with Acuna and Albies and Ozuna now in the middle. The key for the Braves to me now, I look at the starting pitching and I say they got a lot of young guys. They need a lot of their young guys to take another step forward. And we saw a great season a year ago out of Mike Soroka, finished right behind Jacob deGrom in the Cy Young Award. They have the Max Frieds and the Sean Newcombs and Kyle Wright. So there's a lot of young pitchers, and I think the big key is to see them take a step forward. They got a couple veterans. They brought in Cole Hamels as a veteran stabilizer in the starting rotation to mentor, if you will, a lot of the younger guys, and I think that's a nice fit there. See which version of Mike Foltynewicz shows up. 2 years ago, had a really good year. Last year battled some injuries, was not nearly as consistent. But if the young guys take a step forward, if Soroka does what he did last year, and Fried becomes a guy they can count on, and Kyle Wright and Sean Newcomb, who kind of bounces back and forth from the rotation to the bullpen, if all these things fall into place, they have a really good rotation, and they're going to score enough runs. It's a very talented team. I talked a couple weeks ago that I think this team has a chance to be the team of the new decade because of how strong the farm system is, how rich it is in pitching, the stars that they have at the major league level. They got all the pieces there. It's a very good organization that's been built from the ground up and built the right way. So I would expect nothing else than the Braves to be right in the mix when it comes to the National League East, despite all the other teams in the mix there with the Nationals and what the Phillies have done to get better, and the Mets, who obviously still consider themselves part of things as well. It's a tough division to handicap, but you'd be hard-pressed to put the Braves any lower than second place right now, and I think the Ozuna deal for 1 year. Interesting that it's 1 year. I kind of thought he'd get a multi-year deal, but it's a good opportunity for him to go out, have a big year, hit the market again next year, and potentially cash in a bigger way. I just really like the fit there, and I think the Braves are doing some really good things this offseason. A good mix of young and old in Atlanta, and I think they're going to have themselves another very fine season. And now I'm going to move into another topic, and one of the things we've talked about throughout this offseason that's been a big theme in baseball is all of the star players that have been on the trading block. And we've heard a lot of the same names, whether it's Mookie Betts and Francisco Lindor and Chris Bryant, and of course Nolan Arenado, who, you know, my feeling was at the time his name was being shopped around, I didn't think it was the best approach for the Rockies to trade him for different reasons. The fact that it would be tough for them to rebuild, the fact that they play in Colorado and they need to find a way to get their pitching on track, and I just think without Arenado, the chances for them to be a contending team take a major hit, and I just don't necessarily trust this front office to make the right move and get quality impact players back in return. Well, the Arenado situation kind of came to a head this week with the Rockies on Monday night when Arenado came out publicly and told different members of the Denver press that he feels disrespected by the organization. And this is on the heels of the general manager, Jeff Bridich, coming out and proclaiming that the team would now not trade Arenado and would start the season with the third baseman on the club. And Arenado comes out and says he feels disrespected. I think there's a lot of reasons behind this, and I read a couple of articles about it that were written in the Denver press. And one issue is that Arenado, after signing the mega deal that he did, believed that he was signing with a team that was going to be committed to winning. And after they kind of fell flat on their faces in 2019 with a 71-91 finish, he feels that he's on a losing team. And this is a guy who plays with such a passion, who has a burning desire to win, that season just did not sit well with him. And then you throw in the fact that the Rockies have been dormant this offseason. They have not spent a single dollar in free agency, didn't make any upgrades during the season last year when their pitching was faltering in a big way. And so I think Arenado's feeling is that the Rockies aren't completely committed to winning, and he feels like the front office didn't play it straight with him, which is certainly understandable. But now the question becomes, you got an unhappy player who's going to be with the team at the start, and you just wonder, even though the general manager came out and saying we're not trading him, well, Arenado's mood might dictate otherwise, and the Rockies might be forced actually to make a move and move the third baseman. So this is a situation that bears watching now to see how it unfolds, and there are a lot of teams that have inquired on his services, whether it's the Texas Rangers, the aforementioned Atlanta Braves. So we'll see how things kind of stack up here. But my feeling at the time was the Rockies' best chance to have a decent season is with Arenado as part of the team, because it's a team that has a lot of talent offensively with Trevor Story, his infield mate, and with Charlie Blackmon and other guys. They're going to score runs playing in that ballpark, and it just becomes a matter of what does the pitching do? And in the years where this team made the playoffs, it was the starting pitching that proved serviceable enough to be a winning team. Last year, that all went backwards, and the team, after an inconsistent start, just really disappeared at the end of the year. So we'll see where it goes, but you got an unhappy star player. It's never a good sign in a situation that now the Rockies have to deal with as we approach spring training. And now for the next segment, you probably know if you watch MLB Network that they've been doing a show for the last few years where they rank the top 10 at each position, which this offseason got underway a couple of weeks back. Well, I'm going to do an abbreviated version and call it a top 5 right now, and it'll be my response to what MLB Network does. And if you're familiar with the show, you know that the Shredder gets to make its picks for the top 10 players at each position, and then the two analysts, host Brian Kenny, and whatever analyst is on with him, typically someone who plays the same position as the one that they're profiling, will give their picks. Well, I'm going to give you who the Shredder had for their top 5 at right field and first base, and then I'll counter with my own selections for the top 5 at said position. And starting with right field, which is just a loaded group, and here were the Shredder's picks for the top 5. They went Mookie Betts, Christian Yelich, Aaron Judge, Ronald Acuna Jr., and J.D. Martinez, with Bryce Harper as the 6th spot. Now, one issue that you have with this is that you have players who profile at certain positions that haven't necessarily played a lot at that position. Like you look here at right field, and J.D. Martinez is a designated hitter. He's not really a right fielder, so I kind of have a hard time putting him on my right field list, even though he's a great hitter, one of the best offensive players in the game. He doesn't do it defensively, though, so I leave him off my top 5 personally. And I also give the ever-so-slight edge to Christian Yelich. I mean, this is a guy that the last 2 years in Milwaukee, what a monster he has become, taking home MVP honors in 2018, and he backed that up with arguably a better season the next year. So how could you go wrong with Yelich, who's also a good fielder in his own right, and I love Mookie Betts. They're both tremendous players, but Yelich, they call the show right now, and I think right now the edge Yelich has offensively over Betts, even though Betts, the better defender, the best defensive outfielder in the game, and obviously a tremendous player all around. I mean, he's the second best player at a loaded position. That's pretty good, but I'm still going with Yelich at number 1. And then I also flip-flop the order for my 3 and 4 guys. I put Ronald Acuna in the 3 spot over Aaron Judge. You compare and contrast these two, I think Acuna just slightly more upside than Judge. The potential for a 50-50 kind of season. He's just that talented of a player and will only get better, whereas Judge, I think we have a better idea where he is right now and don't necessarily see him getting much better. Certainly the potential to hit 40, 45, even 50 home runs. He's obviously going to have a tremendous on-base percentage given how many times that he walks, his patience at the plate, and is a fine right fielder in his own right. Moves tremendously well for a guy of his size, throws well. He's a great all-around player. I'm just giving Acuna the slight edge because he's younger, and I think there's more upside in him that could take him to a higher level than Judge potentially. And then instead of J.D. Martinez, who I talked about for the reasons that I don't have him in the top 5, being the fact I don't look at him as a right fielder, hasn't really played that much outfield, especially lately since he's gone to Boston. So I'm going to go Bryce Harper in the number 5 spot, who, as any baseball fan knows, is the biggest lightning rod in the game right now. He's one of those guys that's well known even for non-baseball fans. So even though I have to say overall there have been years where I've been a little bit critical on Harper, I thought at times he is a bit overrated because when you look at his career, he had the one tremendous season when he won MVP, and a lot of years I feel like he falls a little bit short of expectations. The thing is, though, the expectations on this guy are always sky high. It started as a 16-year-old when he was featured on the Sports Illustrated magazine, and this is something that he's carried with him his entire baseball life, and he may not have quite reached some people's expectations, but the bottom line is he still is an extremely talented ball player with the potential to hit 50 home runs and put up monster numbers. After not such a great start in his first year in Philadelphia a year ago, he did rebound and had a pretty big second half. I look for him to have a monster year this year. I think the time is right. I think Joe Girardi's going to get the most out of that Philly team, get the most out of Harper. I think he's primed for a big year now with the Phillies, a better team with the upgrades that they've made. He's at the right age. I'm really expecting big things from Bryce Harper in 2020 and a chance to climb the ladder even from being the number 5 right fielder right now, but certainly very deserving to land a spot in the top 5. And now over to the first baseman, where the Shredders list goes as follows for the top 6. Freddie Freeman with Max Muncy, Pete Alonso, Anthony Rizzo, Paul Goldschmidt, and Matt Olson taking the number 6 spot. And I moved a couple of things around. I agree with most of the guys the Shredder has in the top 5. Freddie Freeman, for me, the no-brainer as the top first baseman. He's done it year in, year out. I almost think he's a bit underrated, that some baseball fans don't realize just how good this guy is and a chance to be a Hall of Famer when his career is all said and done. And then because we call this the top 5 right now, I think right now you have to go with Pete Alonso in the number 2 spot because some of the other guys maybe had a little bit of down years. Paul Goldschmidt and Joey Votto, who's fallen out of the top 10 entirely, according to the Shredder, and I don't really quibble with that despite how good of a career he's had. But because we call this right now, Pete Alonso is coming off a phenomenal season, 53 home runs as a rookie. Now it remains to be seen what he does for an encore and if he does approach the numbers that he put up as a rookie, but you can't go wrong putting him right behind Freeman. I even saw one list from Jason Stark breaking it down on MLB Now. He had Alonso number 1. Now, I'm not quite going there. I still give Freeman the edge, but I have no problem with Alonso being right behind Freeman, and that's where I have him right now. The power potential, the guy just is the whole package. I mean, you listen to him speak, he has it all together. He's got the right attitude, the right temperament, a guy that teammates love, and it's really going to be fun to watch him in Queens for the next so many years, we hope. I mean, we've seen guys in New York who we thought were going to be fixtures for a long time. Ike Davis comes to mind when he first came up as a first baseman. Thought he would be a long-term answer. Didn't wind up being the case, but I would bet that Alonso is going to be a long-term answer, not just based on what he did as a rookie, the way he carries himself, how motivated he is to be the best version of himself. He really just is the kind of guy you want to have on your team. Good guy to root for, and my number 2 first baseman right now. Then I put Anthony Rizzo 3 and Paul Goldschmidt 4, 2 of kind of the elder statesmen who've been doing it year in, year out, maybe not quite on their games as they were in their prime, especially in Goldschmidt's case, but still can't go wrong with those two. And I round out my top 5 with the A's Matt Olson, and this guy does it both sides of the field. He's an outstanding fielder, won the Gold Glove the last couple of years, and oh, by the way, hit 36 home runs in not even a full season. So he's got immense power, and with Matt Chapman represents 2 cornerstone players on the Oakland infield for a lot of years to come. So I replace Olson in my top 5 with Max Muncy, who the Shredder has number 2. To me, that's too high. I would put him somewhere between 6 and 10, and Olson gets the nod for me. So again, my choices for the top 5 first basemen right now: Freddie Freeman, Pete Alonso, Anthony Rizzo, Paul Goldschmidt, and Matt Olson. And with that, I'm going to move into this day in baseball history, and it was on this day, January the 23rd, back in 1962, that Bob Feller and Jackie Robinson were elected to the Hall of Fame in their first years of eligibility. Feller won 20 games 6 times, while Robinson, besides breaking the color barrier, led the Dodgers to 6 pennants in 10 years. And very fitting that our This Day in Baseball history comes with a note on the Hall of Fame on what is Hall of Fame week. And so I'm going to close this program for the 9th inning doing another note on the Hall of Fame. And one issue that comes up is the steroid guys, namely Bonds and Clemens, and not that big of a jump for them from last year to this year, which is interesting considering that their time is running thin, and I see both sides of the argument when it comes to these players. I know some writers are of the opinion, gung-ho, that no cheater deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, and under no circumstances are they ever going to vote these guys in, while the other school of thought is that these guys were so good, and that yes, there were a lot of guys doing steroids, but only some rose above the rest, like Bonds and Clemens, who were 2 of the most dominant figures in baseball. And can you really leave off an entire period of the major leagues without putting in a Hall of Famer, especially when you had worthy candidates, steroids notwithstanding? And I just think at some point people are going to come to the realization that the numbers were just so staggering that these guys are going to get in. I don't know when. I don't know if it's going to take a Veterans Committee, maybe by their final year of eligibility on the regular ballot, but my opinion would be it was a period in baseball history that happened. I don't think it can be ignored, and these guys were just so good that eventually they're going to have to find their place in Cooperstown. As for Curt Schilling, he was the closest not to get voted in at about 70%, and the issue for Schilling is that he was so disliked by the writers. All of his controversial comments since he's become an ex-player, it just hasn't sat well with the writers, and you can say, well, it should only be about their playing, but it's human nature, and when you have guys like Schilling making such unlandish comments, such negative comments, I think it's a big reason that he comes up just short, because the numbers, he's not a slam dunk Hall of Famer. He's a borderline guy, but probably overall above the line, a guy whose postseason pedigree puts him over the top. He doesn't have gaudy win totals, just over 200 for his career, but the feeling is eventually he will get in, perhaps as soon as next year. And again, I think the writers will just have to get over their personal feelings towards him, and Schilling will eventually be a part of the Hall of Fame. And then one note to close things out is I want to highlight some guys who fell off the ballot after just 1 year. And to me, this just represents how difficult it is to be a Hall of Famer. The fact that it's the 1% of players, and how there are so many good players out there who don't even get a sniff, and players who didn't get a single vote. And we're now at the point of the Hall of Fame, for me and for people of my generation, where we've seen a lot of these guys' entire careers. So it's easy to make our judgments as to whether they're Hall of Famers or not, as opposed to, say, 10 years ago, where all we can do is look at their baseball reference pages because we don't have any experience watching their careers. But now we watched Paul Konerko and Alfonso Soriano and Cliff Lee play for a lot of their careers, all of which tremendous players. What do they all have in common? They're all off the ballot after just 1 year. And in a way, it's kind of a shame because these are players that now aren't going to be talked about too much despite their tremendous playing careers. And then I highlighted a couple here that got not a single vote. Josh Beckett, Sean Figgins, Brian Roberts. Roberts was a player I really enjoyed watching as an Oriole, guy who led the league in doubles a couple times, good all-around player, stole bases, good hitter, hit at the top of the order for a lot of bad teams, but just a really good baseball player and not a single vote for the Hall of Fame. So to me, it just goes to show just how good you have to be. Cliff Lee 1 year, 22-3, won the Cy Young Award, was a good big game pitcher, was really good year in, year out for a lot of winning teams. Falls off the ballot after 1 year. Alfonso Soriano, all the leadoff home runs that he hit and how good of a player he was. Paul Konerko, power hitter year in, year out with the White Sox. So tremendous players don't even get a sniff of the Hall of Fame, and it just shows you how difficult it is. So that's why when you see a career like Derek Jeter, it's really one to revere and celebrate because the Hall of Fame is special, and I think the Baseball Hall of Fame in general just has a more special feel. The fans are connected to it more than any of the other sports Hall of Fames, and they hold it in such high regard. And then one final note is this has been a long ninth inning. There's a lot of runners on base for this ninth inning, folks, but I was going to mention this in the segment where I talked about Marcell Ozuna, that we had a couple other signings, so I'll close with this. One involving one of the best pitchers of this generation. Felix Hernandez is no longer a Seattle Mariner. He now signs a minor league deal with the Braves, who we talked about earlier in the program. But Felix, just a revered icon in Seattle for all of his accomplishments there, and such an electrifying pitcher in his day. Well, obviously, everybody has their day where they're no longer on their game, and for Felix, the performance has been slipping now for the last few years, and it's now at a point where he is reserved to sign a minor league contract and just hopes he's a bubble player that can make a team and make some kind of impact should he make the major league roster. So Felix to the Braves. Alex Gordon, another player very much synonymous with his organization in the Kansas City Royals. Some thought that he might retire. Well, he does reach an agreement with Kansas City to go back there on a 1-year deal worth $4 million. A guy who has carved out a nice career for himself, came up as a top prospect, didn't live up to early expectations, but found himself once he changed positions and became an all-world defensive player in left field, winning 4 or 5 Gold Gloves, whatever it might be, and a key player for the winning teams that the Royals had, winning back-to-back pennants, including a World Series. So Gordon back for at least 1 more year before perhaps he does call it quits. And then a couple of minor league deals that the Phillies agreed to yesterday with the former Met and Yankee Neil Walker, and also the left-hander Francisco Liriano. And so with that, that closes this edition of the Brian on Baseball podcast. I thank you for joining us today. Had a lot to get to with the Hall of Fame, more free agent signings to break down, a lot on our show. We'll have another one for you next week where we have 2 new positions to break down as far as the top 5 right now, plus whatever happens in baseball, any more signings that come down, and yes, any more in the aftermath of the sign-stealing scandal, whether we have more managerial vacancies that are filled, there are still 2 out there, and any more ramifications that come on that. You can follow me on Twitter at Brian Goudsword. And so from Middletown, New Jersey today, thanks again for listening. Our thanks, as always, go to Dylan DePrato. I'm Brian Goudsword. We'll see you next week. Have a good day, everyone.